Looking back, it's strange how the quiet moments often hold the loudest warnings. I can vividly recall the way Catherine used to hum while washing dishes, or the subtle bounce in her step when she was excited about something. Those little things used to bring me peace, but over the past few years, they had all but disappeared. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like a slow leak in a tire you don't notice until it's flat, leaving you stranded. I've always been a man who tries to fix things. Broken engines, leaky faucets, strained relationships, you name it, I've taken a crack at mending it. But no amount of effort seemed to bring Catherine and me back to where we once were. The woman I had spent decades building a life with, the fiery redhead who could make me laugh or cry in equal measure, was slipping further and further away, and I was starting to wonder if I had any tools left to stop it. Over the past month, my wife Catherine had grown distant, her moods erratic, and our connection strained. The past 3 months had been particularly challenging, but this last one was the worst. Catherine, fiery as ever, carried her Irish temperament like a badge of honor, which often meant heated arguments and prolonged silence. We've been together since high school, dating at 18 and married for 22 of our 26 years as a couple. Despite her sharp edges, I'd always loved her red hair, freckled skin, and the passion she brought to our life. But lately, things were different. This morning was a surprise. After weeks of tension, she woke me with gentle caresses, a stark contrast to her recent behavior. Last night's argument was still fresh in my mind. She'd come home late, demanding intimacy with a bluntness that sparked another fight. Afterward, she retreated to a long shower, leaving me to stew in my frustration. These episodes of hers weren't new, but the prolonged nature of her moods recently was wearing me down. Normally, I knew how to navigate her temper, but this time it felt different. We hadn't always been like this. Early in our marriage, our passion for each other was insatiable. Back then, I worked as a mechanic and she had a job at Target. We didn't have much, but we had each other, before work, after work, and even sneaking moments when we could. Life was simpler then, filled with love and lust. But as the years passed, life shifted. 8 years ago, I transitioned from a mechanic to managing a Napa franchise, an opportunity that promised to set us up financially. It wasn't an easy decision, and Catherine had been furious when I accepted the job without consulting her. Still, I saw it as a chance to provide for our family and be more present for our kids who were immersed in sports. The job brought changes, a flexible schedule but longer hours, with evenings and weekends often consumed by work. Catherine struggled with the stagnant salary, and my reassurances to trust me didn't ease her concerns. Over time, her frustrations grew, and so did the distance between us. 2 years ago, I began noticing a change in her. She became more irritable, her temper sharper, and her words sometimes cutting. Attempts to address it led to fleeting improvements, but the underlying tension always returned. Meanwhile, the business was thriving. We'd expanded to 4 locations, and I was proud of what I'd built. But the success came with sacrifices. Our relationship suffered, and home became a place of tension rather than comfort. Catherine, now managing an insurance office, seemed overwhelmed by the stress of her role. When I asked her what had changed, she'd either shut down or lash out, leaving me with more questions than answers. This morning's unexpected intimacy stirred something in me. As I showered, her words from earlier, "I like how you do it," lingered in my mind. She'd said it countless times before, but today it felt different, almost hollow. I couldn't shake the unease, even as I tried to focus on the moment of connection we'd shared. Our lives had become so tangled in responsibilities and unresolved tension that even small gestures felt laden with complexity. I dressed and went about my day, reflecting on the Catherine I fell in love with and the one I lived with now. Beneath it all, I knew we both carried the weight of our choices and the years that had shaped us. The morning's fleeting connection was a reminder of what we once had, but the lingering doubt in my heart wouldn't let me ignore the cracks that had formed between us. Over the weekend and into the following week, life settled into what had become an unsettling new normal. Catherine's irritable mood persisted, her temper sharper than ever. By Friday evening, the cycle repeated itself. She came home late, demanding intimacy in the same commanding tone as the week before, only this time, her insistence was even stronger. Her attitude infuriated me. When she coldly stated, "I need you to serve me," I snapped. "I'm not at your beck and call. Handle it yourself." Refusing to give in, I spent the night in our son Kevin's old room, which had been vacant since he moved out months ago. The next morning, as I went to grab clothes from our bedroom, Catherine was in the shower. Her phone chimed with a text notification. By sheer chance, or perhaps fate, I noticed it. A few years ago, a phone update made it possible to preview messages without unlocking the device. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the screen. The message was from someone labeled KB and read, "Well, did he do it?" Confused and unsettled, I tried to make sense of it. Who was KB? What was it? My mind raced, piecing together the past 2 Fridays, her strange behavior, and the peculiar way she'd recently said, "I like how you do it," with an emphasis that felt different, almost comparative. A sick realization began to creep in. Was she trying to make me erase traces of someone else? The thought made my stomach churn violently. I rushed to the bathroom and vomited. Catherine's voice startled me. "Are you okay, honey?" she called out from the shower. I glanced at her briefly, her wet hair clinging to her face, water dripping from her body, but the sight only deepened my nausea. "I think I'm coming down with something," I muttered, needing an excuse to avoid her and gather my thoughts. She reached out to check my forehead, but I stepped back. "Stay away. I don't want you to catch whatever this is," I insisted, before retreating to Kevin's room, feigning illness to avoid her. My thoughts spiraled as I lay there, replaying the past few months, and even the last 2 years. Had she been unfaithful? The suspicion gnawed at me. My high school sweetheart, my wife of over 2 decades. Was she no longer mine? I needed answers, but most of all, I needed proof. That afternoon, I devised a plan. I had no access to her phone or passwords, but I'd have to find a way to uncover the truth. Luck came quickly. While Catherine was in the kitchen later that day, her phone buzzed again. I glanced at it and saw another message from KB. I made a reservation for Wednesday afternoon. My heart sank. What kind of reservation? A hotel? Afternoon restaurant reservations weren't common. My gut told me this wasn't innocent. Deciding to follow her on Wednesday, I used my job's flexible schedule to my advantage. Over the next few days, I avoided Catherine as much as possible. Pretending to be sick made it easier to keep my distance, though sharing a bed with her on Monday and Tuesday felt unbearable. How quickly love could turn to resentment, I thought bitterly. On Wednesday, I left work during lunch and drove to her office. Parking on a side street, I had a clear view of the building's lot. My stomach twisted with anxiety as I waited. Hours passed with no sign of her leaving, and I began to second-guess myself. Was I being paranoid? Had I misread the situation? At 2:30, her boss walked out alone and drove off, intensifying my doubts. But just when I was ready to give up, Catherine stepped out of the office. My heart pounded. Every instinct told me this wasn't innocent, and I was determined to find out the truth. It all came to a head that afternoon. Was Catherine's meeting with her boss innocent, or was my suspicion right? I stayed back, watching as she left work and drove straight to a motel. Not a hotel with conference rooms, but a roadside motel where the rooms faced the parking lot. I parked out of sight and observed her car pull up next to another one, her boss's. She lingered in her car for a moment, and when she got out, I noticed she wasn't wearing a bra anymore. She walked to one of the rooms, and as she reached the door, it opened. Her boss stood there in his underwear, welcoming her inside. I took photos on my phone until the door shut. Everything I feared was true: betrayal, disrespect. Fury burned inside me as I drove home, formulating my response. Our house, situated on the outskirts of the city, was my refuge, particularly the detached 2-car garage I had turned into a workshop. It wasn't just a workspace, it was my sanctuary, complete with a lift for cars, tools for repairs, and a small room upstairs I called the doghouse, where I'd sleep when arguments with Catherine boiled over. It was to this space I retreated, clearing out my belongings from the house and moving them into the garage. I wasn't staying under the same roof as her anymore. When Catherine came home later that evening, she was all charm, trying to lure me into the bedroom again. She had no idea I'd seen everything. I played along, waiting for the right moment. As she undressed and prepared herself, I stretched out on the bed, trying to keep my disgust in check. My mind replayed the images from the motel. She climbed onto the bed, her touch cold to me now. After a few moments, she cooed, "Serve me, baby," just as I expected. Her eyes were closed, but mine weren't. I stood, opened a drawer, and pulled out a protection. "What are you doing?" she asked, startled. "Taking precautions," I replied calmly. "I don't know where you've been." Her face turned red with rage, and she exploded, hurling insults at me, her voice full of venom. "You're nothing! A pathetic auto parts manager who hasn't even asked for a raise in years!" I dressed quietly as she ranted, her words confirming what I already knew. She didn't respect me. Everything I had done, sacrifices for her, for our family, meant nothing to her. Once I was dressed, I left without another word, retreating to the doghouse. Minutes later, she was in the garage, screaming at me to come out. I ignored her, locking the door and moving furniture in front of it. That's when I smelled gasoline. I peered out and saw flames spreading through the garage. Catherine had lit it on fire. Panicked, I unlocked the door and climbed out a second-story window onto the roof. She was standing in the yard, watching the blaze with a twisted smile. I jumped down, twisting my ankle on the gravel, and crawled away as she ran toward me, fists flying. I tried to shield myself from her blows when the police arrived. One officer called for the fire department while the other restrained Catherine, who screamed, "Burn in hell, you bastard! Your precious doghouse is gone!" The officers separated us, taking statements. Catherine was arrested for domestic violence, arson, and potentially attempted murder. I later secured a restraining order barring her from coming within 150 yards of me, our home, or my workplace. Catherine remained in jail awaiting arraignment, and I began piecing my life back together. That evening, I explained everything to our children. Caitlin, our youngest, wasn't surprised. She'd seen her mother's temper for years and offered me a comforting hug. Kevin, older and more reserved, was furious but said little. I reassured them both, apologizing for the chaos. Despite everything, my priority was clear: my kids. They were the reason I'd worked so hard to provide a stable life, and they were the reason I would move forward from this nightmare. Irish luck may have set this chain of events in motion, but it also gave me the strength to end it. The following Monday, I met with another attorney at the firm and initiated the divorce process. When I returned home, a police car was parked in the driveway. Catherine had been allowed to retrieve some personal belongings under police supervision. She had evidently posted bail, likely with her lover's assistance. I read the order aloud to her before turning and walking away. That weekend was quiet. I began clearing the remains of my garage, salvaging what I could. Most of my tools survived, but the diagnostic equipment was destroyed. When I contacted my insurance agent, he explained that the claim might face complications since Catherine shared ownership of the garage. Resolving that would be a future battle. As I worked, I reflected on our relationship. Catherine had been my first love, and until now, my only one. But I was clearly not hers. Trust was a foundation for me, and her betrayal had demolished it. Forgiveness wasn't an option. I held grudges, and this level of disrespect was unforgivable. Still, I needed answers. Was Carl the first? What led to this? Did her behavior stem from my shortcomings, or had Carl fed her a narrative that diminished me in her eyes? Curiosity drove me to investigate Carl Benson. A quick internet search revealed that he was hired 2 years ago to oversee her company's 4 locations, allowing the owner to retire. Coincidentally, this was around the time Catherine's demeanor changed. Carl, a divorced father of 3, lived about an hour away. His history raised more questions about how long this had been going on. Determined to learn more, I decided to contact the company's owner, a man I'd known casually over the years. He often serviced his cars at my old garage and was someone I respected. Reaching out to him went on my Monday to-do list. On Sunday evening, Catherine called, her tone surprisingly apologetic. "Kurt, I'm so sorry for everything, especially the fire," she began. "So?" I replied flatly. "Can I come home?" she asked. "No, I have a restraining order," I said bluntly. "I know, they told me about it when Mom and Dad bailed me out," she admitted. "Good for them," I said coldly. "I'm not interested in talking," she pleaded, claiming her actions were a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment. When I mentioned seeing her at the motel with Carl, she fell silent before trying to deny it. I hung up, unwilling to entertain more lies. Later that evening, her father came to my door. He was a kind man I'd known for over 25 years, almost a second father to me. He appeared confused, seeking clarity. "She told me you had a fight and kicked her out," he said. "Half true," I replied, before explaining the fire and her infidelity. His face darkened with disbelief and pain. "How long?" he asked softly. "Not sure, but things have been off for 2 years, and the past 3 months were unbearable," I admitted. He left, devastated. Hours later, I received a brief text from him. "I'm sorry." Catherine must have confessed. The next day, I called her company's owner. "I hate to bring this to your attention," I began, "but I thought you should know why my wife and I are divorcing." I explained her affair with Carl Benson. The owner was disappointed but not surprised, mentioning he'd had misgivings about hiring Carl. "I'll deal with this," he assured me. But I appreciate the heads up. I asked him not to fire Catherine, explaining how her income would impact the divorce. He agreed, valuing her professional contributions. By Friday, Carl's bad week hit its peak. His car broke down and had to be towed, delaying his arrival at work. When he finally showed up, the company owner was waiting to fire him for inappropriate conduct. Later that day, Catherine called in a fury. "What did you do?" she snapped. "Nothing," I replied calmly. "Maybe it's time we stick to communicating through our lawyers." Ignoring her follow-up calls, I shifted my focus. Using information about Carl from my research, I contacted his ex-wife. She was more than willing to assist in my plans, sharing her own grievances against him. That weekend, I made a dinner reservation at a family favorite restaurant and invited Kevin and Caitlin to join me. My intent was clear. Catherine and Carl needed to see the strength of the family they'd tried to undermine. Revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about reclaiming control over the life they'd disrupted. Months after filing for divorce, everything began to fall into place. That weekend, I arranged a dinner with my children and a guest, Carl Benson's ex-wife, Molly. We arrived early, and when Molly joined us, I introduced her to Kevin and Caitlin. Their initial confusion turned to shock as I explained that she was the former wife of the man their mother had been involved with. Over dinner, Molly shared her story of betrayal and the eventual breakdown of her marriage. She spoke candidly about forgiveness, trust, and the impossibility of rebuilding a relationship without it. Her honesty struck a chord with all of us. By the end of the evening, my children were engaged in the conversation, asking questions and sharing their own observations about the changes they had noticed in their mother over the past year. It was eye-opening and painful to learn how much they had suspected long before I had. After dinner, Molly and I stayed out for a few hours, dancing and talking. While she invited me to her hotel room later, I declined. As tempting as the idea of revenge through a fleeting romance was, I wasn't ready. The next morning, we met for breakfast, where a familiar waitress noticed the absence of my wife. Though I could see judgment in her eyes, Molly and I laughed it off, knowing word would get back to Catherine. Unsurprisingly, Catherine called days later, furious about the dinner and breakfast with Molly. Her anger only deepened when I reminded her that she'd forfeited the right to question me the moment she betrayed our marriage. Shortly after, I learned from my attorney that Catherine had finally signed the divorce papers, likely after consulting her father. Our first interaction post-split was at Caitlin's graduation. Though we avoided each other during the ceremony, Catherine found an opportunity to confront me later, questioning my relationship with Molly. Her snide comments were met with calm deflection, but I noticed how worn she looked, older, thinner, and clearly burdened by the fallout of her actions. She admitted Carl had moved out of state after losing his job and struggled to find work, leaving her behind. Despite her insistence that she never loved him, I couldn't overlook the damage she had caused. My parting words to her were blunt. "You didn't love me enough either." Her tearful reaction drew sympathy from her mother, but I walked away, unwilling to engage further. The divorce process unfolded with minimal financial complications. Catherine and I sold the house, split a modest sum, and avoided alimony since our incomes were comparable. Our children, thankfully, remained my priority. Caitlin's college tuition was covered through a second mortgage, and Kevin used his share to open his own auto repair shop. His ambition mirrored mine, and I felt immense pride watching him carve out his path. Catherine, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions. Pleading guilty to arson, she received a suspended sentence and was required to attend anger management classes and therapy. Over time, these seemed to help, though the distance between us remained unbridgeable. After the divorce was finalized, Catherine reached out, asking to meet and talk. Her request was unexpected, but I agreed. She suggested we meet at our old favorite restaurant, a place that once symbolized happier times. For the first time in a long while, I wondered if closure might finally be within reach. I arrived at the restaurant a little early and noticed Catherine already seated, looking nervous but more composed than I'd seen her in months. We exchanged polite greetings, ordered our meals, and made small talk. It wasn't until the plates were nearly empty that she broke the silence with an apology. Her voice was low, her eyes fixed on her plate as she admitted she'd lost sight of the sacrifices I made for our family. She explained how she'd misjudged my decision to prioritize our children over ambition, mistaking dedication for complacency. Therapy and anger management, she said, had helped her recognize the destructive path she'd taken. Her remorse seemed genuine, and while I appreciated her acknowledgement, I knew there was no repairing what was broken. We parted with a hug, and as I left, she made a suggestive remark that hinted at rekindling intimacy. I brushed it off, knowing that chapter of my life was firmly closed. On the drive home, I called Molly, Carl's ex-wife. We'd grown close over the months since our initial meeting, bonding over shared frustrations and similar wounds. When I asked if she was free, she admitted to a brief fling with someone who'd since moved on. Her candidness and warmth were refreshing, and we quickly arranged to meet at her place. Dinner at her house was relaxed and intimate, with her children away for the week. Before things progressed, I laid my cards on the table. I explained my motives, part revenge, part self-reclamation, and assured her I didn't want her to feel used. Molly was equally honest, admitting that she too saw this as a way to reclaim a sense of control over her life. We agreed that while our connection wasn't about building a long-term relationship, it could be exactly what we both needed in the moment. What followed was electric. Molly was confident, passionate, and uninhibited, a stark contrast to the strained intimacy I'd experienced in the last years of my marriage. As we lay together afterward, she marveled at how well I understood her needs. Her compliments restored a part of me that had been eroded by betrayal and doubt. We spent the night in each other's arms, sharing stories and laughing. Molly's ability to mix vulnerability with strength left me in awe. But I knew our connection was rooted in shared pain, rather than a foundation for something lasting. She hinted at wanting Carl to find out about us, and I admitted I wouldn't mind if Catherine knew as well. The idea wasn't about spite, but rather a small, satisfying closure to a difficult chapter. The next morning, as I drove away, Molly kissed me passionately and expressed hope for more moments like this. I assured her I valued our time together, but admitted I wasn't ready for anything serious. We parted on good terms, each understanding the other's boundaries. Later, I texted Catherine, leaving a vague message to ensure she knew I wasn't completely out of reach. Her quick response, less than 3 minutes later, only confirmed how much she still wanted control, even as she realized she'd lost it. That night, I reflected on how far I'd come. Molly had helped me reclaim a sense of worth, but I knew my journey wasn't about revenge or new connections. It was about finding peace and rediscovering myself after years of betrayal and chaos. One quiet evening, I found myself back at a familiar pub, Smitty's, seeking solace in the comfort of routine. Life had been chaotic, and familiar surroundings helped me focus. While nursing a beer at a small table, I heard a familiar laugh. Catherine's. She entered with a group of her coworkers, their chatter filling the room. She froze momentarily upon spotting me, but quickly composed herself, directing her friends to a table on the opposite side of the pub. Despite their efforts to avoid me, the layout of the room meant they'd have to pass my table to reach the restroom. Sure enough, after a few minutes, 2 women from her group walked by. One stopped at my table. "You're Catherine's ex, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. I nodded, unsure what to expect. Her tone was friendly, almost flirtatious. As they returned from the restroom, both women paused to chat, their light banter catching me off guard. One was about 10 years younger than me, the other perhaps 15. They seemed uninhibited, their conversation playful. I couldn't help but flirt back, knowing full well that Catherine was watching from across the room. It felt petty, but the chance to unsettle her was too tempting to resist. As one of the women turned to leave, she shook my hand, slipping me her business card with her phone number scribbled on the back. Her name was Shannon Lozano. I discreetly pocketed the card, glancing toward their table. Catherine's eyes were locked on me, her expression a mix of sadness and simmering rage. I'd seen that look countless times during our marriage, but now it held no power over me. Reflecting on our relationship, I couldn't deny I had loved her deeply. Part of me still did. But living with her was like residing at the base of an active volcano, always on edge, waiting for the next eruption. I endured it for years, blind to the toll it took because love made me willing to accept almost anything. It wasn't until her betrayal that I finally saw the cracks in our foundation. My thoughts turned to the business card in my pocket. Maybe I'd call Shannon. Maybe I wouldn't. Revenge was still a lingering temptation, but I wondered how much longer I'd let it dictate my actions. For now, it was enough to know I was free. Free to choose, free to rebuild, and free to move on, one small step at a time. Was I in a better place now? Maybe. Ignorance might not be bliss, but distractions helped. Finishing my beer at Smitty's, I left a tip on the table and walked out without glancing toward Catherine's table, unwilling to let her see the emotions brewing beneath my calm exterior. Late Saturday morning, I pulled Shannon's business card from my pocket and dialed the number. She answered with a mix of curiosity and warmth. Our conversation was brief but straightforward, leading to plans to meet that evening at the same bar. I hadn't been on a date in over 25 years, and the prospect both excited and terrified me. Arriving at Smitty's dressed slightly sharper than necessary, I wanted Shannon to see the effort I'd put in. Our conversation flowed easily, and as the evening progressed, I gathered the courage to ask why she wanted to meet me despite working with my ex-wife. She candidly shared that Catherine, long before her affair, had spoken highly of me during office conversations, details that piqued Shannon's curiosity. Shannon's playful flirtation left little doubt about where the evening was headed. Back at my place, our connection deepened as we shared a passionate night together. Her post-coital praise echoed a familiar phrase. "I like how you do it." While the compliment stroked my ego, it also dredged up memories of Catherine and her betrayal. Sunday morning was spent lazily in bed, followed by lunch at a local restaurant. Before parting ways, Shannon made me promise to call her again, and I readily agreed. On my way home, I discovered another surprise, a note from the waitress at Smitty's tucked into the bar receipt with her number. It seemed I'd stumbled into a new reality where dating worked differently, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to keep up. By Monday, I found myself back at Smitty's, this time chatting with Helen, the waitress. Her warm demeanor and quick wit intrigued me, and we made plans for her day off. The same day, another call came in. Bethany, one of the women who had briefly stopped at my table with Shannon, was reaching out. After hearing from Shannon about our weekend, she decided to ask me out herself. I agreed, wondering how long this unexpected wave of attention would last. The week unfolded with a whirlwind of dates. Wednesday with Helen was delightful, and Saturday with Bethany proved just as thrilling. Each woman brought something unique to the table, and while I wasn't looking for anything serious, their companionship boosted my confidence in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the time Molly invited me over for dinner on Sunday, I was genuinely enjoying the newfound freedom of single life. Of course, it wasn't long before Catherine caught wind of my escapades. On Monday evening, she called, her familiar tone laced with irritation. She demanded to know why I was dating younger women, particularly those from her office. Her frustration amused me, especially when she revealed that her coworkers whispered behind her back, calling her a fool for letting me go. I countered calmly, reminding her that we were no longer married and I was free to date whomever I chose. While her protests escalated, I refused to entertain her demands. I assured her that I wasn't dating anyone to spite her, though I acknowledged any discomfort it caused her as an unintended perk. Her frustration boiled over, culminating in a sharp, "You're an idiot," before she hung up. As I reflected on the conversation, I realized that for the first time in years, I was truly in control of my life. Whether or not these new connections led anywhere, I was determined to enjoy the journey and leave the past firmly behind me. Life had taken a surprising turn. My days were filled with fleeting moments of pleasure, yet my thoughts often wandered back to the past. On Wednesday, another evening with Helen reminded me how much my ego thrived on the attention of these women. Each encounter felt like a small victory over the scars left behind by Catherine. Then, on Thursday, Catherine called again. Her tone was accusatory as she confronted me about my connection with Helen. I kept my responses measured, reminding her that she had once criticized me for dating younger women, so perhaps Helen was a more suitable choice. Her irritation softened into a thin, regretful voice as she admitted, "I'll just tell them I was stupid." And with that, she hung up. The conversation left me reflecting on our relationship. Catherine and I had once shared so much, but something shifted when Carl entered her life. Perhaps the seeds of betrayal were planted even earlier. Her recent admission of regret stirred mixed emotions in me, part satisfaction, part longing for a past that could never return. I knew too well that the damage was irreparable. Feeling the weight of those thoughts, I decided to head to the store. With a case of Shiner Bock in hand, I was ready to drown my sorrows when my phone rang. Shannon's voice greeted me, bright and inviting. She offered to join me, promising to lift my mood. I agreed, and soon we were sharing drinks, laughter, and intimacy. Her praise afterward, so familiar yet gratifying, was another boost to my bruised self-esteem. As she left, she reassured me with a playful smile, "Anytime." Over the next year, my circle of friends with benefits expanded. Shannon, Bethany, Molly, and Helen each brought something unique to the table, and I found myself embracing the variety. Each woman taught me more about how to please them, and their shared praise fed my confidence. Catherine initially lashed out, calling me a hoe, but her insults carried no sting. I enjoyed my newfound freedom and the company of women who appreciated what I had to offer. The words that started it all, "I like how you do it," became a common refrain, a reminder of how far I had come from the broken man I once was. Eventually, Catherine's anger faded, replaced by curiosity. One evening at Smitty's, she approached me and suggested we rekindle things for old time's sake. Her proposition held no appeal. I explained gently that what we once shared had been rooted in love, but now it would only be about convenience. She nodded sadly and returned to her table, leaving me with a sense of closure. The day I had worked toward for years finally arrived. The Napa franchise was mine. The previous owner stayed true to his word, offering me a deal that was generous, yet still required a significant loan. The business was thriving, and I had no doubts about its success. Ironically, I had built this future with Catherine in mind, imagining financial security for us both in our later years. Now, it would only be for me. To mark the occasion, I decided to invite Catherine to dinner. I arranged for a car to pick her up and reserved a table at the best restaurant in the city. When she arrived, she was stunning in a black dress that perfectly highlighted her red hair and green eyes. For a brief moment, I remembered why I had fallen in love with her all those years ago. As she approached, I stood and greeted her warmly, complimenting her appearance. She returned the gesture, curious about the significance of the evening. I told her it was a celebration, but kept her guessing as we sat down. The night felt like a delicate balancing act between the past and the present, a chance to honor what had been while firmly embracing what was to come. The evening began with light-hearted conversation as we worked our way through the appetizers. By the time the main course arrived, our dialogue turned more serious. Catherine fidgeted for a moment before breaking the tension. "I can't take it anymore. What are we celebrating?" I smiled knowingly. I was wondering how long it would take for you to ask. After our wedding, I reminded her, I had worked as a mechanic, a job that seemed to satisfy her at the time. Catherine admitted she'd been content back then, but felt frustrated in her own job, especially as our kids became more involved in sports. She recalled how her rigid work schedule had limited her ability to participate in their activities. "That's why I thought the Napa job, with its flexible hours, would be a positive change," I explained. She sighed, acknowledging her reaction at the time. "I remember exploding at you when you brought it up. And I told you it would pay off in the long run," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "I took that job for us, for our kids, for their dreams, and for a better future." Catherine looked down, sadness evident on her face. "And I destroyed it," she whispered. "That's not why I asked you here tonight," I said. "This isn't about rehashing the past." Her hopeful expression encouraged me to continue. "Today, I signed the papers to purchase the Napa franchise," I announced. "I now own 4 stores." Her face reflected a mix of shock and disbelief. I reassured her, explaining how the business would provide financial stability for years to come and create a legacy for our children and future grandchildren. The pride in my voice was unmistakable. Catherine's expression shifted to deep regret. Tears welled up as she confessed. "Carl told me you were a failure. No ambition, no goals, no future." I believed him. And because of that, I lost respect for you and us. It became easy to say yes to him when he promised me something better. I ruined everything. Her voice broke as she apologized, tears falling freely. "You were a great husband, an incredible father, and the best lover, and I threw it all away. I'm so sorry, Kurt. I hope you can forgive me." Overwhelmed, she excused herself to the restroom. Watching her retreat, I felt a pang of sympathy, but knew I couldn't console her. The pain of her betrayal still lingered, and reopening that door would only lead to more heartache. When Catherine returned, she looked composed but fragile. I stood, letting her know the bill was paid and offering to drive her home. The car ride was quiet, filled only with her quiet sobs. At her apartment door, she hesitated, inviting me inside. I declined gently but firmly. "We can't go back there," I said. She nodded, tears brimming, and closed the door. The following years were a whirlwind of work and fleeting relationships. My reputation with women seemed to spread, and I found myself enjoying a steady rotation of companions. Though I made no promises, I ensured every encounter was safe and consensual. Catherine and I remained in contact, primarily about our children. When Kevin announced his engagement to Amber Williams, a client who had visited his shop, our conversations increased. Kevin, ever cautious, hesitated to commit until his business gained stability, but his connection with Amber was undeniable. On the day of their engagement party, held in a rented room at the Sheraton Hotel, I arrived early to help Kevin set up. Catherine came in as we were finishing preparations, still looking striking after all these years. She approached me at the punch bowl with a wistful expression. "We never got engaged, Kurt," she said softly. "No, but everyone knew we were together," I replied. "Do you remember how you proposed to me?" she asked. "Of course," I said, smiling faintly. "Some things, no matter how much time passes, stay with you forever." Resentment and frustration often simmered beneath the surface when Catherine and I crossed paths. At Kevin and Amber's engagement party, she managed to reignite those feelings. Her sharp tone carried an air of condescension as she suggested we be cordial, a habit from our marriage that grated on me. Despite occasional moments of genuine regret, Catherine's old temper and coldness often resurfaced, leaving me caught between conflicting emotions. As the party unfolded, Kevin and Amber greeted their guests warmly. Laughter and conversation filled the room, but one voice stood out, Amber's, calling for her mother. I turned and saw a striking woman, dressed in a floral sundress that accentuated her graceful figure. Her golden blonde hair and deep blue eyes made an immediate impression. Kevin noticed my reaction and quickly pulled me back to reality, warning me off with a smirk. He explained that Amber's mother, Elise, was deeply religious and wary of men after her husband's infidelity, making her unlikely to give me a chance. Still, Kevin introduced me to Elise, and I couldn't help but admire her poise and radiant smile. As we exchanged pleasantries, Catherine appeared, interrupting the moment to assert herself in typical fashion. She joined the conversation with Elise, leaving me to step aside. It was Catherine's way, always inserting herself at the wrong time. Recognizing the need to maintain a good first impression, I decided to distance myself for the time being. Throughout the party, I mingled with guests, many of whom teased me about my reputation with women. Some interactions were friendly, while others were awkward, but Catherine couldn't resist creating chaos. At one point, she undermined me in front of a divorced guest, Charisse, hinting at my supposed promiscuity. Frustration boiling over, I excused myself and led Charisse away to escape Catherine's interference. Though I had no romantic interest in Charisse, it served as a pointed gesture to irritate my ex. Later, I finally managed to speak to Elise privately. Her initial skepticism was evident as she acknowledged my reputation, her tone sharp and cautious. She expressed her concern for Amber's happiness and emphasized the importance of faithfulness in marriage, clearly shaped by her own experiences. I reassured her of Kevin's integrity, proudly highlighting his work ethic and commitment to Amber. Gradually, her demeanor softened, though her wariness remained. As we spoke, Elise suggested we clear up any misconceptions between us. Her reluctance to trust me was understandable, given her past, but I urged her to allow us a chance to talk openly. After some hesitation, she agreed, proposing a meeting the following day after her church service. She chose a Cracker Barrel near her home as a neutral setting, ensuring I would make the effort to see her on her terms. Though the engagement party had its share of tension, meeting Elise had given me a glimmer of hope for something meaningful. Her guarded nature intrigued me, and I looked forward to peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed walls. Elise had shared the details of her church, including the service time and location, and I agreed to meet her there. Throughout the remainder of the engagement party, our glances occasionally met across the room. I suspected I intrigued her, even if she viewed me with skepticism. I was perhaps a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. As the party drew to a close, Catherine approached me, her tone laced with concern. She voiced her worries about Kevin and Amber rushing into marriage, citing their relatively short courtship of just 18 months. I calmly reminded her that while quick relationships might present challenges, even long-term ones, like ours, weren't guaranteed to last. Ultimately, commitment mattered more than time. My response left Catherine pensive, clearly reflecting on her own choices. Though her regret was palpable, I found a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing she still grappled with the consequences of her actions. The following morning, I woke early and prepared carefully for the day ahead. Dressed in a suit, I made the hour-long drive to Elise's church, arriving well before the service. The sanctuary was starkly different from the Catholic churches I was accustomed to. Gone were the ornate, stained glass, candles, and solemn altars. Instead, a simple platform with a cross stood at the front. The casual attire and coffee-carrying congregation made me feel overdressed and out of place, but I was determined to see the morning through. As the service began, I scanned the room, wondering if Elise had decided not to attend. Then I spotted her, singing with the worship team. Her voice carried effortlessly, commanding the room, and when our eyes finally met during the third song, she smiled warmly. After the music ended, she joined me in the pew, her presence both comforting and disarming. I confessed to feeling overdressed, and she suggested I remove my jacket. Following her advice, I began to feel slightly more at ease. The service, while foreign to me, was relaxed and engaging. Elise introduced me to the pastor afterward, along with several members of the congregation, referring to me as Amber's future father-in-law. Her hospitality surprised me, given her earlier skepticism. At Cracker Barrel, our conversation began lightheartedly but shifted as we finished our meal. Elise's tone turned direct as she confronted me about my reputation. She accused me of being a womanizer, someone who pursued women only to abandon them once he got what he wanted. Rather than take offense, I calmly clarified. By her definition, I wasn't a womanizer. I explained that I hadn't actively sought women, but had simply responded when they approached me. I recounted my story with honesty. Catherine, whom Elise had met at the party, had been my wife for over 2 decades. Toward the end of our marriage, she began an affair with her boss, treating me with disdain for months before I uncovered the truth. When I confronted her, the situation escalated dangerously. She attempted to set fire to our garage with me inside. That betrayal marked the end of our marriage and the start of my life as a divorced man. After the divorce, women started approaching me, likely fueled by conversations Catherine had about me. Their curiosity about my reputation led to a string of encounters, but I made it clear that I never pursued anyone. Instead, I saw these interactions as mutual agreements, where I valued their company and sought to make them feel special. I admitted to enjoying the connections, but also emphasized that I never turned anyone away, regardless of appearance or background. As I spoke, I could see Elise processing my words. I ended by expressing my regret if my actions offended her values, but I felt it was important to be truthful. Whether or not she accepted my explanation was up to her, but I hoped she would at least see me as more than the rumors suggested. Elise fixed her gaze on me with a hint of skepticism, her tone sharp as she asked, "And where exactly do I fit into all this?" I took a moment, gathering my thoughts. "Elise, you're an extraordinary woman. It's clear you've endured as much as I have. While I turned to communication and connection, I've heard you shut yourself off from men entirely after your husband's betrayal. I want to meet someone who values monogamy, someone I can trust and build a life with. I'm still searching for that one woman who could be my forever." She studied me carefully. "What about Catherine? Didn't she want to reconcile? Couldn't you just forgive and forget?" I shook my head slightly. "Forgiveness may be possible someday, but forgetting is out of the question. Once trust is broken, the relationship is tainted. You start questioning everything. Where they are, who they're with. That constant doubt makes rebuilding impossible." Elise nodded, her voice softening as she admitted her own struggles. Her ex had wanted to sweep everything under the rug and carry on, but she couldn't do it, not for him and not for herself. The betrayal had shattered her self-esteem, and she wasn't willing to risk being hurt again. I agreed, sharing how, while I had continued spending time with women, I never let them get close to me emotionally. She acknowledged the similarity but pressed further, asking again where she fit into my world. "I think we're both working through trust issues," I said, "but I'd like to take you out, get to know you better, and see if we could build something meaningful." Her brow lifted slightly. "And what about all these other women? If, after spending more time together, we both feel this is right, I'd happily commit to you exclusively." Elise's expression turned serious. She laid her boundaries out clearly. No physical intimacy until marriage. I reassured her, recounting how Catherine and I had waited until our wedding night. Her concerns eased, and she admitted to liking me, agreeing to see where things might lead. Over the next 4 months, Elise and I met regularly, alternating between her place and mine. I also continued dating other women, but my interest in them waned. Even the compliments that once boosted my ego, like Charisse's "I like how you do it," began to feel hollow. The empty flattery only underscored how different things felt with Elise. One evening over dinner, Elise told me she was ready to commit. Her words filled me with joy, and I assured her of my devotion. I confessed my love, knowing it might be early in our relationship, but feeling it needed to be said. To my relief, she admitted she was falling for me too and asked for my patience as she processed her feelings. That patience paid off as our bond deepened. I found myself in the happiest place I'd been in years. Then, one day, Catherine called, her voice unusually cheerful. She suggested we meet for dinner, explaining she had something important to discuss. When I asked if she wanted to go out, she insisted on privacy, offering to cook my favorite meal, roast beef with vegetables. Her offer left me curious, if not slightly wary. I agreed, promising to bring wine, though I couldn't shake the feeling she had an ulterior motive. After hanging up, I called Elise to share the news. "She's probably planning something related to the wedding," Elise suggested. "Call me later and let me know what's going on." Her advice helped calm my unease, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that Catherine was trying to soften me up for something big. At exactly 7 p.m., I stood in front of Catherine's door, my stomach twisting with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner would be about more than roast beef and polite conversation. She greeted me warmly, and we settled into small talk as we worked through the meal. But as the plates emptied, Catherine finally revealed her true reason for inviting me over. She admitted that Kevin's upcoming wedding had stirred memories of our own. Her tone softened as she reminisced about our early days, how we'd met, fooled around, and laughed endlessly, even without crossing certain lines. I agreed those times were good, though I could sense where the conversation was heading. She began asking questions I had hoped to avoid. What had gone wrong between us? Why had we fallen apart? She mentioned overhearing Shannon and Bethany at work, both reflecting on their brief encounters with me. Catherine surmised that I'd grown tired of my so-called rounds. Her words hinted at a longing for reconciliation, and she finally asked outright if we could try again. It was a painful moment, but one I had prepared for. Over time, I had realized the importance of forgiveness, not for her sake, but for my own. Calmly, I told her, "I forgive you." The relief on her face was immediate, but before she could take it as an invitation, I clarified. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Trust was broken, and it couldn't be rebuilt. Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded for another chance, expressing her regret for all she had done. Her voice cracked as she apologized, but I knew I couldn't give her what she wanted. Gently, I explained the truth. I was in love with someone else. Catherine froze, the weight of my words sinking in. When she finally managed to speak, she asked who it was. I told her simply, "Elise, Amber's mother." Her shoulders sagged as understanding dawned. She knew me well enough to realize there was no coming back from this. Despite our history, she could see that my heart now belonged to someone else. The rest of the meal passed in silence, the atmosphere heavy but resolved. Before leaving, I thanked her for the dinner and the memories we had shared. I wished her well and encouraged her to love fully when she found someone new. As I walked out of her apartment, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. Driving away, I called Elise to share what had happened. She wasn't surprised, having suspected Catherine's intentions all along. I told Elise how grateful I was for her, how knowing her had changed me for the better. For the first time, she told me she loved me, her words filling me with joy. Kevin and Amber's wedding came quickly, and Elise and I were inseparable throughout the celebration. We laughed, danced, and held hands, drawing teasing remarks from others about how much we looked like a wedding couple ourselves. Catherine was there, but she left early, likely unable to handle seeing us so happy together. 3 months later, Elise and I became a wedding couple for real. It was a small, intimate ceremony at our church, filled with family and friends. Catherine didn't attend, citing a scheduling conflict, though I suspected it was her way of avoiding the reality of my new life. Years later, she found someone new, and I genuinely hoped it would work out for her. As for Elise and me, our bond only deepened. On our wedding night, as we lay together, she whispered the familiar phrase, "I like how you do it." This time, though, the emphasis was on the word like, a quiet testament to the love and trust we had built together. Life had come full circle. Standing on the porch of the home Elise and I built together, I marveled at the quiet peace that now defined my days. The chaos and heartache of the past had faded, replaced by the warmth of love and a future filled with hope. Elise joined me, her golden hair glowing in the setting sun. She handed me a glass of iced tea, her touch as familiar as her laughter. "You're quiet," she said softly. "Just thinking how lucky I am," I replied with a smile. Her hand found mine, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. The years had taught us that true strength came from weathering life's storms together. Each misstep and heartbreak had led me here, to her, and to a love built on trust and understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. For the first time in years, the future felt like a promise, not a question, and I was ready to embrace it.